Hi, in this video we're going to talk about modified waterfalls lifecycle models. Um, the activities identified in a pure waterfall model in previous video are intrinsic to software development. You can't really avoid them. You have to come up with a software concept, you have to get requirements from somewhere, you don't have to use the waterfall cycle model to gather requirements, but you do have to use something. Likewise, you can't avoid having an architect to design a code. Um, Most of the weaknesses in the pure waterfall model arise not from problems with these activities, but instead from the treatment of these activities as disjoint with sequential phases. You can therefore correct the major weaknesses in the pure waterfall model with relatively minor modifications. You can modify it so that the phases overlap. Um, you can reduce the emphasis on documentation. You can allow for more regression. Well, so first let's talk about the sashimi life cycle. Um, Peter deGrasse he describes one of the modifications to the waterfall model as the sashimi model. The name comes from a Japanese hardware development model from Fuji Xerox and refers to the Japanese style of presenting sliced raw fish with the slices overlapping each other. The fact that this model has to do with fish doesn't mean that it's related to the salmon life cycle model. So this figure here is showing what the sashimi model looks like. The traditional waterfall model allows minimal overlapping between phases at the end of phase review. This model, however, suggests a stronger degree of overlap. So, for example, it might suggest that you might be able to well into the architectural design and perhaps partway into detail design before you consider requirements analysis to be complete. So, this is a reasonable approach for many projects which tend to gain important insights from what they're doing as they move through their development cycles and which function poorly with strictly sequential development plans. In the pure waterfall model, the ideal documentation is documentation that one team can hand to a completely separate team between any two phases. So most people question this and ask why. If you can provide personnel continuity between the software concept, the requirements analysis, the architectural design, detail design, and coding and debugging, you actually don't need as much documentation. You can follow a modified waterfall model and substantially reduce the documentation needs. The sashimi model is not without its own problems because there's overlap between phases. Milestones are more ambiguous and therefore it becomes harder to track progress accurately. Performing activities in parallel can also lead to miscommunications, mistaken assumptions, and also inefficiency. So, if you're working in a small, well-defined project, something close to a pure waterfall model can be the most efficient model available. Another modification in waterfall is the waterfall with subprojects. This stems from another problem with pure waterfall. From a rapid development point of view, is that you're supposed to be completely done with the architectural design before you begin detail design, and you're supposed to be completely done with detail design before you begin coding and debugging. Systems do have some area that contain design surprises, but they have other areas that have been implemented many times before and that contain no surprises. So, why delay the implementation of the areas that are easy to design just because we're waiting for the design of a difficult area? If the architecture has broken the system into logically independent subsystems, you can actually spin off separate projects, each of which can proceed at its own pace. Um, this diagram kind of gives a bird's eye view of how that might look. Um, the main risk with this approach is unforeseen interdependencies. You can partly account for that by eliminating dependencies at architecture time or waiting until after detail design time to break the project into subprojects. Another modification that you may have to do waterfall is waterfall with risk reduction. Another of the waterfall model's weaknesses is that it requires you to fully define requirements before you begin architectural design. which seems reasonable, except that it also requires you to fully understand the requirements before you begin the architectural design. Modifying the waterfall again only slightly, you can put a risk reduction spiral at the top of the waterfall to address the requirements risk. You can develop a user interface prototype, use system storyboarding, conduct user interviews, videotape users interacting with the older system, or use other requirements gathering practices that you think are appropriate. Um, so this figure kind of shows the waterfall model with the risk reduction. Requirements analysis and architectural design are shown in gray. Well, it's not that clear in this diagram. Um, but this indicates that they might be addressed during the risk reduction phase rather than during the waterfall phase. The risk reduction preamble to the waterfall cycle isn't limited to requirements. You could use it to reduce architectural risk or any other risk to the project. If the product depends on developing high risk nucleus to the system, you might use a risk reduction cycle to fully develop the high risk nucleus before you commit to a full scale project. The last model that I'll talk about that is a modified version of the waterfall. Is the V model. This is a variation of the waterfall model that demonstrates how the testing activities are related to analysis and design. The model's linkage of the left side with the right side of this V implies that if problems are found during verification and validation, then the left side of the V can be re-executed to fix and improve the requirements, design, and code before the testing steps on the right side are reenacted. So, in other words, the V model makes more explicit some of the iteration and rework that are kind of hidden in the waterfall depiction. So, whereas the focus of the waterfall is often documents and the artifacts, the focus of the V model is activity and correctness. So that brings us to the end of the modified waterfalls that we will discuss in this course. Thanks for watching.